Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Blunt. This is my channel, Whose Else Would It Be? Today we're continuing our series, Republicanism Explained, by looking at the difference between monarchies and republics. A lot of you might think that they're antithetical, but the truth might surprise you. Let's go! Okay everyone, it's going to be a quick video this week, but I want to touch on one of those basic conceptions people have about republicanism, and that's that it is the opposite of monarchy. Now there is certainly a grain of truth to this intuition. Like, let's look back in history. The first republic, in the sense of the tradition of thinking about freedom as non-domination, is Rome. Brutus and his fellow conspirators kick out the last Tarquin king from Rome and then assassinate his followers, including Brutus's own sons, hence the famous painting by David of a republican virtue of putting the public good ahead of your private happiness. What seems to be going on here is when the Romans got rid of the king and replaced him with two consuls, they were saying you cannot put power in the hands of a single person. This makes us all subject to arbitrary power. Because remember, that bedrock of republicanism is the idea of freedom from domination. And this seems to be echoed in the debate around the English Civil War, right? Hobbes is contesting the idea of liberty with Republicans, and the Republicans, people like James Harrington and Algernon Sidney, they say that the mere presence of Charles I as the King of England is anathema to the freedom of all other English people. Why do they think this? Because the king believed that he had a negative voice in English politics, that any legislation coming through Parliament could be vetoed by him, that in effect Charles I believed himself to be unconstrained in his use of power, and that he clawed back taxation power, he acted arbitrarily, he tried to arrest members of Parliament without charge. All of these things made English Republicans convinced that there could not be a monarch in England if you valued freedom. And that's why they chopped off his head, because Charles I actively made war against Parliament, which they viewed as the sovereign voice of the people. And indeed, they cut off his head for treason, which is an interesting intellectual puzzle, right? The king is the head of state. Can you commit treason against yourself? Well, it all depends on where sovereignty lies, in crown or in Parliament. And this is why Hobbes, of course, was so keen on disputing the idea of freedom. Because if we get that liberal idea of freedom as non-interference, then it doesn't matter if arbitrary power exists. All that really matters is if it's not used. And we can see this echoing again in the debates around the American and French revolutions, where Republicans were actively trying to separate from the monarchies of Britain and France because they viewed it as a source of arbitrary power. This is the language used by the Founding Fathers. It's the language used by both moderate sort of Girondists and radical Jacobins in the French Revolution. But is it necessarily true that monarchy is incompatible with freedom from domination? Well, the answer is a little bit more subtle than perhaps the polemics of the past reveal. If all monarchies were absolute monarchies, then the idea that liberty and monarchy are incompatible would make sense. But this is not the only model of monarchy that we have. For example, we have constitutional monarchies. This is best embodied in the British monarchy, English then British monarchy, post-1688, post the Glorious Revolution, where the power of the monarch was constrained by an unwritten constitution in which sovereignty resided clearly with Parliament, and the king or queen of the day could not act without the advice of their ministers and could not reject the advice of their ministers on certain grounds, right? Once we start hemming in the power of the monarch, we get something like a crowned republic. And we can also see this in the history of republicanism. Think about the Venetian Republic, the Serenissima, right? The most serene republic. They called it this because it was such a stable system of government that lasted for so long. The head of the Serenissima was the Doge, who was Doge for life and was elected. It was an elective monarchy in which the power of the Doge was divided between various other elements of the Venetian constitution. The idea of constitutional monarchy might be compatible with freedom from domination by reducing the arbitrary power of the monarch. The king or queen can no longer exercise that negative voice that the stewards believed they had. It is now, as Guy Fieri would say, out of bounds. The power of the monarch can be checked by parliament, by the courts, and if the king attempts to reach over their power limit, then they can expect to be deposed, the same way that James I was deposed. Was it James I? I think so. Wrong. It was James II. Okay, so the takeaway that we should have from this episode is that what Republicans are concerned with isn't whether there's a king or a president in charge of the state. It is how power is distributed within the state, right? If a president is president for life and has no constitutional controls over them, then they're just as dangerous to liberty as a king. If the king has their powers constrained so that they're non-arbitrary, well, this is compatible with Republican freedom. Because we have to remember, what's really important for a Republican isn't whether the head of state is a king or a president, it's whether there is arbitrary power in a political system. A king and a dictator who doesn't wear the label of king, they're just as dangerous to liberty under certain circumstances. What really matters is the shape of the Constitution. And that is going to be the topic of our next video. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take care.